I am so excited about this conversation, Deanne. You and I were speaking just off camera, and first of all, I am a wow fan. I mean, what you've accomplished and to go through and do what you've done as a female, as a very tiny person who also has to carry an enormous amount of camera gear with the things that you do. I have to ask you, first question right off the bat, do you consider yourself a trailblazer?
A trailblazer. Yeah, I guess so. If I think back to when I started in the industry. My first job was working as a staff photographer at the San Francisco Chronicle. And at the time, there were 3 of us, women, on a staff of 15 total. So what I was doing was different. Not a lot of women were working as photojournalists, not even working as photographers, really. So I have seen a shift in the industry from then, fortunately.
You know, I'm kind of with you because for over 30 years being in television and choosing to not only go into television news, but to go into meteorology. I was starting back in the 90s. You were a little bit ahead of me, starting in the 80s. And when I got named chief meteorologist for WOAI in San Antonio, Texas, I was one of the first females to be named a chief meteorologist for any station in America. And it was kind of like, whoa. And so I'm kind of a little different from you. I didn't necessarily set out to become that trailblazer. It just kind of naturally happened. So I kind of want to take you back to when you started getting into photojournalism. Was that what you were initially going for when you were young? Did you always want to be a photographer, be behind the lens, feed your creative juices that way? Or did you kind of get there taking, say, the broken road, perhaps?
Yeah, broken road is a good analogy, especially if we change it to broken down on the road. Let me take you back to this time. I had just graduated from high school in Massachusetts. And I had this adventurous spirit. I kind of lived in a small town, but I wanted to go out and see the world. So I announced to my mother, I was probably like 18, 19 years old, and I said, "Hey, Mom, I just bought an old van, a Ford Econoline van, and I'm going to drive it across the country with my best friend, Sue." And she was horrified. And she said, "Deanne, that van is not going to make it even out of town, let alone across the country." I said, "Mom, don't worry. It's going to be fine. I had it checked out." So Sue and I start heading off on this big adventure to California. And we got about as far as New Jersey, and the van blew up.
Wah, wah.
Exactly. Thank you for the sound effects. That's what it felt like. So, it was midnight, and I'm driving. Sue's in the back sleeping. It was one of those kind of vans, like shag carpeting and these like fold-down plywood beds. And so Sue's sleeping in the back. I'm driving, and all of a sudden the engine just starts making these crazy noises. Like a sledgehammer was attacking the engine. So I somehow was able to get off to the side of the road. We're talking the New Jersey freeway and maybe 6 lanes of traffic. Got off to the side of the road somehow, and it's like, "Hey, Sue, the van broke down and it's not starting."
Sue, wake up, we're in trouble.
Big trouble. So we didn't know what to do, and of course this was pre-cell phone. So we get out of the van and we stick out our thumbs and thinking maybe we could, flag down a ride. And this big rig truck stops to pick us up. And, it took the driver about a mile to actually stop, so we had to run to catch up with him, jumped in the vehicle, and it turned out fine. He was a very good human being. It could have turned out very badly, but he was great, and he took us to this diner where we met Rosie. And he said, "Don't worry, girls, Rosie will take care of you." And she did. And so, one thing led to another, and we eventually made it to California. Now, you know that I could not call my mother and tell her that she was right, that the van broke down before we get to California. And so I said, what's another plan of action here? I called my father. And they weren't together at that time. So I just said, hey, Dad, do you still have that old station wagon that you offered me once when I said, no, I don't drive station wagons, I've got a van? And he says, yeah, I still have it. So went back to Massachusetts, got the van, and...
Wait, did your mom know that you were back in Massachusetts?
No.
You just bypassed. You pivoted.
Yeah, I couldn't tell her. I eventually told her. But we finally made it to California, and I just fell in love with San Francisco and the Bay Area. And I loved the adventurous lifestyle of being on the road, having to figure things out. I mean, getting across the country was not easy. We were very inexperienced with traveling. But I just loved being on an adventure, fell in love with California, and then I said, I just have to figure out how to get back to California. So once I was back in Massachusetts, I started applying to colleges in San Francisco and got accepted at the Academy of Art. So my plan was to become an artist. I loved painting and drawing. And so I started down that route for my first year there. And I just realized that, this really isn't for me, because a lot of the work was in a studio by myself. And that just didn't agree with me. I needed to be out in the world, meeting people, just learning about the world. I needed adventure. So I pivoted and went towards graphic design and photography. I started taking a lot of photography classes, and when I first took a photojournalism class, I said, wait a minute, there's such a job where you can travel the world telling stories. You can, just be photographing, on the front lines of what's happening in the world, news and culture and adventure. And so at that moment, I was sold, and that was it. And so that was my beacon, and I just headed towards that.
You found what you fell in love with. So I'm hearing certain traits from that story that I think probably were significant as you've gone through over the years, and then of course developing Think Tank Photo, and those being a little bit of stubbornness, that I think some of these might parlay for folks that are perhaps with a brand that may not be, globally known yet, or as big as some of the other brands that are here, that I think are important to maybe kind of reference and talk about how they played into jumping forward a couple of decades, parlayed into Think Tank Photo of the stubbornness, the ability to pivot, how important connections are. Have you found those things at a very young age that you probably didn't realize were setting your stage for the career path that you would go on, ultimately helped you start a business?
Absolutely. I think it's just a matter of being true to who you are. And these were traits that I was learning about myself at that time. And so stubbornness, yes, but perseverance more than anything, because it took incredible perseverance to get my first job, to get hired at the San Francisco Chronicle, and just kind of anything I went towards, there were a lot of doors that I had to figure out how to open. There were a lot of no's, and how do I turn a no into a yes? And so, so I was being true to who I am and developing these life skills, like making it across the country in that van. It was good training for being a photojournalist, because it was problem after problem after problem that I had to solve.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think one of the things is you carry all of your own equipment. And do you know how much all your equipment weighs when you put it all together? I mean, are you carrying 20 plus pounds probably when you go on shoots?
It varies, it depends on what I'm doing. Like when I'm covering a sporting event, like the Super Bowl or World Series, I'm carrying a massive lens, like a 400 2.8, just a significant lens and just a lot of equipment, multiple bodies, multiple lenses. And so, yeah, it's hard. And so I've just had to think about how do we solve these problems.
So let's take it to, since you just brought up sports, let's take it to one sports legend in particular, Barry Bonds. Will you share that story and maybe the lessons of what it taught you? Because this plays into, look, you're a female, you're shooting in a male-dominated industry, especially at the time. It's changed some, but especially at the time. And you go up to one of the superstars in his field. Tell me about that story and the biggest lesson you learned from it.
Yes. So at the time, Barry Bonds, like you say, biggest star in baseball, he was breaking all the records, all the home run records. But in addition to that, he was always very difficult with the media, with photographers. He didn't want to be photographed. He would intimidate us. So while I was out there trying to capture these moments of when he set a record, Barry's at 599. When he hits 600, that's another milestone. So you go out to the ballpark and you try to get ball on bat of the 600th home run. Challenging, lots of anticipation, but
lots of things that go, edit into the trash can.
Yes. Oh yeah. There were so many.
Click.
There were so many that didn't make it. Yeah. But I was out there covering all those games, and I really became interested in who he was as a person. Thinking why is he intimidating us? Why is he treating us like that? What is going on? So even though I was covering the action, I was really curious about who he was as a person, kind of the humanity of the player. So I went to the Giants, the team that he was playing for, and I told him I'd like to photograph Barry behind the scenes, do a more human story about him, what he does when he's not on the field. And they just kind of snickered and said, Barry's not going to go for that. It's not going to happen. If you want, you can talk to his agent. So I have
to ask you, did the Chronicle know that you were asking that kind of question and trying to get that access, or did you just go on your own hoping to get the scoop?
I went on my own.
Good for you.
At that point. Yeah, because I wanted to get the access before I told them. And it was very difficult. Nobody had ever photographed Barry, behind the scenes, anything other than on the field. And so I went to his agent, and same thing. The agent just kind of snickered, no, Barry's not going to do that. So it's okay, but this was still in the back of my mind. Who is this guy? So the next season starts. I go to spring training in Arizona, and when most of the players show up, they go running around the field, and you photograph what they're doing, training, preparing for the big season. When Barry arrives, it's a big deal. All the editors want that picture. Barry's here. And so I'm looking for Barry. I see he's arrived. But when he gets to the field, he just sits down on the field, just kind of laid back on the field. And I'm thinking, wow, that's strange. No one...
Not stretching, just kind of I'm here. Exactly. Like a lump on a log.
And I'm thinking, what's that about? So I raised my lens to photograph him. I had a long lens on a monopod, and he looked at me and glared at me like he was furious, like he wanted to kill me. And I'm thinking, what is that about? And it was so awkward and so uncomfortable, and I was, kind of ruffled my feathers a little bit. And I said, you know what? We're both adults. I'm going to go talk to him. Now, he's on the field, a place where photographers normally don't go. There's a lot of media behind me, all the other photographers and writers. And I'm sure they saw me walking towards Barry, and they were petrified for me. But
Because you're not the most intimidating stature person.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I didn't know what I was going to say to him when I got there. I just knew that something had to be said. So I start walking towards him, and I hadn't really thought it out. So next thing I know, I'm standing over him. I've got my long lens, and this just came to me. I said, "Hey, Barry, do you have a problem with me photographing you? And if so, are there some boundaries that I should know about?" Now, like I said, I hadn't thought it out because he's there with a bat. So it could have gone really badly. But instead, he just paused and thought about it for a minute. And then he says, "No, I don't have a problem. What's your name and who are you shooting for?" I told him. And he says, "Okay, I'll call you Dee." And so from that moment forward, he let me into this world where he didn't let anybody else. And then he would always stop and talk with me, just small talk. And one day I said, "Hey, Barry, your fans want to know who you are. I want to photograph you behind the scenes. I want to photograph you at home with your family." And he agreed. And so I got, an incredible body of work that showed who Barry was as a person. And he came across differently than the Barry that we had thought we knew.
Did he ever tell you what it was about that moment that made it in his mind okay for you to photograph him?
I really should have asked him about that, but I never did. I was afraid that if I brought it up, it might backfire. Like he might say, "Hey, yeah, you did that, didn't you?"
Well, I think maybe, you had the guts to do it. To, at the time, one of the biggest names in not just baseball, but in all of sports. And that you perhaps went up, "Hey, do you have a problem?" and offered setting some boundaries, which also parlays well into business too.
Yeah, exactly. And, it could have gone badly if he said, "Yes, I have a problem, do not photograph me," because my editors were waiting for photos, and I had given him permission to say no. So that would have been a problem, but I hadn't really thought that out. The other thing is, so many photographers came up to me afterwards, and, the buzz around was, "Wow, Deanne's photographing Barry behind the scenes. Where did that come from?" And the word on the street was, "Oh, he let her in because she's a woman." Now, there may be some truth to that I was less intimidating, but as you said, I had the courage to approach him.
Well, yeah, we're going back a couple of decades when that would have been, the reality is I was hired for my first television job because I was a blonde female, and things have certainly changed for the better for that type of stuff. But it just sounds like to me it's facing whatever the conflict is and that you took it head on and you didn't shy away. And I kind of want to also talk about, because I know doing the human interest types of not just one photograph, but photographic series are near and dear to your heart. And I would love to know what got you the Pulitzer Prize. Did you know when you were filming that, in the process of it, that it could potentially lead you to that highest level? Or it was just something you in the moment became so passionate about, and that your love is what comes through in those images?
Yeah, I had no idea as I was working on this story that it would lead to the Pulitzer. It was not on my radar at all.
How did you get the story?
Yeah, okay, so I was working as a staff photographer at the Chronicle at the time, and my editor came back and said, "Hey, Deanne, this little Iraqi boy was just brought into Children's Hospital for medical treatment." This was around the start of the war on Iraq, 2003. And it was just an incredible series of circumstances that brought him to America. He was a 9-year-old boy named Salah Khalaf. He picked up what he thought was a ball when he was walking home from school along with his brother. The ball turned out to be a bomb, and it blew up in his hands and severely injured him. It blew open his abdomen, he lost an eye, and his hands were blown off. his brother actually died in the explosion as well. So his dad came to the scene, picked him up, brought him to an Iraqi hospital, and they said, "We can't save him. Your only hope is to go to the Americans." And the dad brought him to an American Air Force base, and somehow, through a translator, was able to explain that his son was about to die and he needed help. And the doctor had a kind heart, and he took him in, was able to stabilize Salah over the next week. He ended up nicknaming him Lionheart because Salah's heart stopped 7 times during that week, and he kept coming back. And this doctor said, "This kid is meant to live." So he wasn't able to do everything that he needed he was stable, but Salah needed more treatment that they didn't have available. So they contacted a doctor in California who said, if you can get him here, we'll take care of him. So through an incredible series of circumstances that went all the way up through the White House, through Donald Rumsfeld, they agreed that Salah could be transported on a military aircraft alongside his father and injured American soldiers, and he was brought to America. And that's where I picked up the story. And there was a lot involved in, the first moment I saw him, it was like, wow, I just had to step outside and collect myself. It was so difficult. He was just barely clinging to life. But I ended up gaining the family's trust. And a writer and I just started documenting the story, and our editors agreed, yes, this is a story you should stay with. And so we just went deep with the story, and we spent a year documenting Salah's ups and downs. Part of that involved going to Iraq because Salah was eventually reunited with his mom. So his mom was granted asylum. And so we went to Iraq and traveled with her back to America to be reunited with Salah.
I have to ask you, you said you had to take a moment. And, I know throughout my career, and even, nowadays traveling the world, when things are not pretty. And as women, we tend to wear our emotions a little bit more on our sleeves than our male counterparts. How do you deal with that? How do you, take it home? When you work in something in the medium that you choose to work in, you don't get to shut it off at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. What are your coping mechanisms to get you through those hard moments?
Yeah, well, photographing Salah was very difficult because it was sensitive, it was emotional. But what I've learned is I need to find how to shut it off to a certain degree so that it doesn't paralyze me, so that I can still work. But I have to feel something so that I can photograph it. Because I think if I completely turn off my emotions, I'm not going to be able to capture those images that make people feel something. So it's this middle ground that I have to find, protecting myself, but feeling the story and feeling the emotion of it.
It's interesting you say that because, of course, I come from a television background. And, there's oftentimes, whether it's been covering tornadoes, covering hurricanes, wildfires. And in those moments when you're on television and you know that you're on air for public safety reasons, but people are losing everything. And then I also think about the photojournalist in the field when there are the mass shootings and how they have to deal with things and how you've had to look through a lens. And in that sense, not fully detach, that care is still there. And I think that's an interesting perspective that I don't think a lot of folks realize, that we take this stuff home. We take it, and it's the stuff that would say, what wakes you up and keeps you up at 2 or 3 in the morning? It's that, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But I believe in the story so much that I just figure out how to get through it. It's like the story is paramount, and my emotions are secondary. I just want to tell the story as truthfully, as honestly as I can, and shed a light on something that other people might not understand. Because at the time, we weren't hearing any stories about how the war was affecting an Iraqi family. So I take pride in that, and I want to do it really well. So I'm somehow able to get through the emotions when that's paramount for me.
Well, after you got that, Pulitzer Prize, then it becomes, what's next? What's the next thing that you're going for? And I will say, your accolades, I think you've probably won just about every photography award that's out there, and that is commendable for the amount of work and the care and the heart that you put in, to your photographs. But after you won, then what was next for you? And I think that kind of parlays for folks of, when you do get a big award with your brand, your business, how do you then set the stage for, okay, well, what is going to be my next goal or my next target?
Yeah, it's hard. I'm always trying to figure out what's the next story that I should work on, and, trying to be true to what I care about. So, I'm working on a lot of different things now with my photography. There are just like certain topics that I'm really excited about. I always have my personal projects that I'm working on. As a matter of fact, one of my personal projects segues well to our last topic, and that is that I have continued to follow Salah's story for the last 20 years.
You have?
Yes.
You are a member of their family.
Pretty much. His sisters say, you have been here for anything important that's ever happened in our lives.
But I think for you too, that shows your heart, first of all, but that you do remain, when things make an impact on you, and I think that's important for people to hear. As a journalist, we are impacted by stories, by people, and it's not always the famous sports person or the big movie star. It typically is the people that are not well known, that have made the impact, or somebody behind the scenes that becomes that critical element. It's just it's so interesting. So are you going to tell us what the project is, or are you still keeping it under wraps?
Well, I haven't really known. I've just known that I have to keep following his story. And so I do. I photograph him. I text with him a lot, and I see him a lot. And, I try to be there to photograph the big things that are happening in his life. Like right now, he's trying to get a prosthesis, and, just dealing with some challenges with that. And, there's some people at Apple that are coming forward with an Apple Vision Pro for him, where he can use his eyes as a mouse. And there's just really interesting things that are happening in his life. And, it's the continued challenges of the effects of war. But, people coming forward to help him as well. And he's just trying to navigate it all. So in terms of what I'm going to do with it, I'm, trying to look towards doing a book and, maybe a film. So
can you kind of parlay maybe the difference of working for a news outlet or working on the human interest type of stories to, you do a lot of work with global brands, ranging, as you just said, Apple, and you also do stuff for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. What's different when you go versus the news side of it to working with brands?
Yeah, well, when I left the Chronicle in 2008, it was different. At the Chronicle, I was a staff photographer, so I would get handed my assignments all the time. It's like, oh, here's what you're going to do today. And I loved it. I loved the challenge of it. Always something new. Where am I going today? What's going to go on? Am I jumping on a plane or what? And so I just loved that. I loved the unpredictability of it and the problem solving of it. I loved. But, after a while, it's like, okay, I'm ready to see if I could branch out on my own. After winning the Pulitzer, a lot of opportunities came to me. And, so I just had to figure out, all right, yeah, I'm ready to make the jump and become an independent photographer. So I started, I just started working with different brands, and it's all still about the same kind of storytelling that I've always done. And that's why people hire me, I think, is for the storytelling aspect of my work, where, I'm a very patient photographer, and so I wait for moments to happen, and I'm not one to be setting up and orchestrating things. I just think real life provides better moments, more authentic moments. So, yeah, and, that year, it was 2005 is when I won the Pulitzer. 2008 is when I left the Chronicle. So a lot of changes were happening around that time, and we also started Think Tank in 2005.
You had a very busy couple of years. You were also still extremely busy. But, it's also interesting to me, too, though, because what I hear from you, because I feel this, and I think you might be the same type, is that I want people to hire me because of my work, not because I am a woman. Being a female is a bonus to me. And I feel like you feel that same. Do you get that? I mean, do you feel like that brands are hiring you now based on the work? Or is there still an element of they're hiring you because of the work and, oh yeah, because you're also female?
I would say most of the time it's because of the work. And you had mentioned earlier about, like networking. And, if I look at any project that I do, I would say like 95% of the projects that I do is because of someone I have met before or a referral. And so, people want to work with someone that they like, for one, and they want to work with people that they can trust. So that's where a lot of my work comes from. There are certain stories that are maybe sensitive where it does make more sense for a woman to photograph it. But I'd say, most of the time these days, I think they're just hiring me for my storytelling work.
Are you seeing more females in the photojournalism space and more independent female photographers that are having success?
Yes, there has been a huge shift in the industry. When I started, like I said, at the Chronicle, there were 3 out of 15. Now, these days, I would say, and I see it a lot. I teach a lot of workshops and, do a lot of mentoring and things. And it seems to be, I don't know, in a lot of the places where I'm looking, I'm seeing about 50-50. Which is really nice to see.
I'm the same, and especially in television and in the weather world, I love seeing so many females. I also have experienced back in the day when we were paying our dues, as it used to be called. It was the first 3 years when you were in your career, where I was given all of the horrible shifts, working every single holiday. And then years later, after I received some national accolades for coverage of Hurricane Katrina, I heard from the person that was my immediate supervisor apologizing for the way that they treated me. And I said, thank you, I appreciate the apology. Here's what you taught me. And it was how I will not treat other people. And thank you for that lesson. Do you have somebody like that you can immediately go back to your head, yep, that person, you don't have to say names, but those types of lessons that we had to learn along the way?
Yeah, there were a lot of lessons, but especially, I think back to when I was, say, on the sidelines of a 49er game, it would be, just all men and me. Like over the years, you'd see a couple of women and then maybe a few more. But, I'm sure that a lot of the male photographers looked at me and said, what is she doing here? And honestly, in the beginning, I didn't really know the game that well. I wasn't that great of a football photographer. But it goes back to that perseverance, and kind of putting blinders on a little bit, like I'm not going to let anybody take me down. I'm just about figuring out how can I do this job as best as possible. And so I just started learning football and figuring it out and knowing where I had to be to have success. Anticipating the action, knowing what a player was likely to do, and just having a vast understanding of the game and of the team so that I could do well. And then the other photographers would see my images in the paper the next day. And so I feel like, it's just a matter of proving yourself. But
do you feel like you had to work harder, though, to prove yourself because you're a woman?
Let's see.
Or is it your persevering spirit that...
Yeah, I do think that
you don't take no for an answer.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think that I was so driven to do this and to do it well that I just had blinders on to any negativity. And
I think whether you're male or female, anyone, when you're going for a goal, it's the drive. When you're passionate about something, it's your drive that's going to get you there, because we're all going to be told no's. We're all going to be told no's, or you're going to lose a job. For me, I ended up losing a job because they was told they were going in a new direction, and ultimately lost the job because I was female. But it ended up being the best thing. So sometimes I think roadblocks are actually just a diversion to the path you're supposed to take.
I agree with that. I agree strongly in that if something horrible happens, when I'm on a shoot and I think, oh, this is just the worst thing that could ever happen, I try to just realize that, what? Roll with it, because the universe might just be sending you in another direction. So just roll with it. Don't freak out about it.
It's just like with travel. Roll with it. I mean, so let's also talk, because I do want to kind of talk about how you are the chief product tester, chief product developer, for Think Tank Photo. And I'm curious how you went from, having your job as, as a staff photographer, and deciding to develop this company that really came out of a need, and especially for females. Talk about that process of how you developed out Think Tank Photo.
Yeah, well, I was working as a staff photographer at the Chronicle, like I said, and my husband, he was working for the competition. So he was a photographer for the San Francisco Examiner.
Battle lines are drawn.
Oh, yeah.
Don't talk about work while you're at home.
Right. And there was definitely a lot of competition when I'd run into him on assignment. It's like, oh, yeah, I think I can outshoot him on this one. A lot of it was fun. He's not as competitive as I am, so he just kind of rolled with it all. But as we were working as photographers, the bags we wanted didn't exist. We were trying to get on airplanes and get our equipment overhead. We were trying to run up and down the sidelines of a football game with a shoulder bag. And, it just wasn't really working. And so we were trying to figure it out, trying to come up with better solutions. And so through a series of things that happened, we ended up meeting Doug Murdoch, and he is the CEO of Think Tank now. He wanted to start his own company, and Kurt and he had been working on some designs of different bags, and he said, I want to start a bag company, and I'd like you to be part of it. Are you interested? And we said, absolutely, we're all in. And so we started designing bags. And now here we are 20 years later, and we have hundreds.
Overnight success of 20 years.
Well, it was funny because right when we launched in January of 2005, and we got really lucky, again, networking, like you say, just a friend of ours knew we were starting the company, and we had, Brad Manton, we had been asking him feedback on some of the bags that we were designing, and he said, hey, I know the guy that's heading up the Super Bowl. Let me see if we can get one of your bags in there. And so he connected us, and next thing we know, we had the bag of the Super Bowl. Every credentialed photographer had one of our bags.
Okay, what is that like when you see it on? I mean, you have to have like goosebumps after goosebumps when you see that on, international television. And just the fact to know that they all have your bag.
It was incredible, especially when we made this connection. This all happened really fast. The Super Bowl was coming up. We made this connection, and we didn't even have the bag designed yet. So we just kind of like mocked something up in Photoshop and sent it to him. And he goes, yeah, that looks good. So we said, okay, we got to work fast. We need to make a lot of bags quickly. But it was incredible. So right out of the gate, we were the bag of the Super Bowl, and people started talking, and all the photographers, just like a small, tight group, and everyone just started talking about our bags. And so, yeah, that kicked things off pretty well, pretty quickly.
Again, you have that ultimate goal to get to, and then how you go from that and keep charging forward, keep going for 20 years later and pushing forward and constantly developing out new things. So I kind of want to, as we start to wrap up and close, I do want to ask, what is your advice to a woman who wants to go into a male, because there are still, both of our industries would be considered male-dominated fields. What's your piece of advice?
Okay, before I give you my piece of advice, I want to say one more thing on think tank that we were talking about, is that I don't want to take too much credit on think tank because, I'm a founder. I was there in the beginning. I'm still involved. But we have an amazing team who really is doing all the work.
And this is why you're a great leader. Because that whole thing, there is no I in team. And to give that credit too, and that you didn't do it alone, and having other people, but you do have your voice at the table and your voice in the decision making, and how important it is to have that for any brand, to have a diverse group of voices at the table when you're making decisions and developing out products. And even if you are in a niche market, that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. To your question, my advice to somebody starting in the industry, I think you just have to be bold and be fearless and go for what you want. Don't let anyone bring you down. Just set your goal of what you want and don't stop.
I love it. I'm going to leave it right there because I think that is such great advice. Deanne, I have enjoyed this conversation. As we said right before this, we need a bottle of wine to enjoy and kick back and relax. Could talk to you for hours. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, giving us a little bit more insight to your life's journey. And especially, I love how perseverance played such a role for you from the very beginning to now, and how you're passing that on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking with you.